Order. Can I remind honourable members that there have been some changes to normal practice in order to support the new hybrid arrangements. The timings of debates have been amended to allow technical arrangements to be made for the next debate. There will also be suspensions between each debate. And can I remind members participating physically and virtually that they must arrive at the start of debates in Westminster Hall, and they are expected to remain for the entire debate. Can I remind members participating virtually they must leave their camera on for the duration of the debate, and they'll be visible at all times, both to each other and to us in the Boothroyd room. If members are attending virtually have got any technical problems, they should email the Westminster Hall clerks, the email address which is westminsterhallclerks@parliament.uk. Members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and leave the room. I'd also like to remind members that Mr Speaker has stated that masks should be worn in Westminster Hall. Tonia Antoniazzi to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 328408 relating to government contracts during the Covid-19 outbreak, and I can say that it is an honour to serve under your chairship, Mrs Verfarg. 31.2 billion has been spent on contracts responding to the outbreak of Covid-19. It may be more now, but that was the figure that I found last week. And anyway, what's a couple of million quid between mates? And I say between mates, a huge amount of money has been channelled into line in the pockets of the pals of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the former DEFRA Secretary, the Health Secretary, the Prime Minister's former advisor Dominic Cummings, and others. I mean, I've been an MP for over 4 years now, and I'm slightly disappointed I haven't had anything offered to myself. You know, I don't move in those circles, unfortunately, or fortunately. When researching for this debate, I uncovered some great investigative work, and I'm grateful to all the journalists, lawyers, campaigners who have shed some light on the deals that have been struck over the last 17 months or so. I encourage people who want to know more of what is going on to look at the Good Law Project website or Sophie Hill's My Little Crony project. Transparency International have produced a scathing report about the state of procurement during the pandemic response. I'm quoting their findings when I say evidence shows that the UK's procurement response to the pandemic was beset by opaque and uncompetitive contracting, a suspiciously high number of awards to those with political connections, and a system for triaging offers of PPE supplies which appears partisan and riven with systematic bias. But I'd also like to thank the petition creators and the signatories of the petition who have enabled this discussion to be held in Parliament today. These campaigners have shed some light on the contracts that have been awarded by the government, but I'd like to go through a short taste of what has been happening behind closed doors whilst our frontline workers have battled to keep us safe from the disease. 560,000 to Public First, a communications agency run by old mates of the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath and Dominic Cummings. The contract was ruled unlawful and tainted by apparent bias by the High Court. Andrew Major Sallin, a former number 10 advisor to David Cameron and twice a parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives, was handed a 102.6 million contract for PPE. To be fair, at least the company in this case, Pharmaceuticals Direct, seems to have a history of in-medical equipment and the appropriate name. However, this contract was again awarded without tender. And what's more, even after the Prime Minister insisted in the Chamber that all COVID contracts were on the record, no details on the contract were revealed until after the Good Law Project wrote to the government about it. And this was 9 months late. Nearly £500 million contract given to Randox with no tendering process. In fact, the Honourable Member for North Shropshire, who was paid £100,000 a year by Randox, was party to a call with the Health Minister in the other place, Lord Bethel, when the contract was extended. That extension, coming after 750,000 tests, had to be recalled because they were not sterile. There's also a contract with a jeweller. One part of the reported 250 million worth of contracts is most interesting. A contract worth 70.5 million to buy sterile gowns. Almost all of which couldn't be used because the contract did not request the double packaging used in sterile settings. The jeweller, Michael Sager, based in Florida, used a middleman to arrange logistics who himself just earned over $16 million from the deal. And again, the contract was published unlawfully late. $425 million contract handed to the NRED to supply free school meals, again without a tendering process, a company that the National Audit Office have said showed limited evidence of their capacity to deliver meals to children in need. In fact, those families who waited nearly a week to receive vouchers would probably say there was absolutely no evidence that they could deliver meals. Sticking with the school meals, can the Minister confirm if there was any due diligence before a contract was signed with Chartwells to provide these meals? A quick search may have raised some questions, even before a food parcel of a few pieces of fruit, tin of beans, 2 carrots, a malt loaf and a block of cheese and a loaf of bread was delivered. Now, I know it's difficult for some people to imagine having to survive on such meagre rations, but when you're able to secure contracts and cushy jobs, I can't imagine you're going to want for much at all. Anyway, the head of Test and Trace for the UK, Baroness Harding, chum of David Cameron, has overseen much of the maligned scheme, which has so far cost £37 billion. That's actually enough for 5 Mars rover missions. Incredible. So where has the money gone? Well, we've been paying private sector consultants, thousands of them, most on well over £1,000 a day, and even on over £6,000 a day. And the Public Accounts Committee was pretty scathing in its assessment of the whole thing, saying that the system doesn't seem the Minister. She needs to ask herself some very serious questions before parroting the lines given to her by her boss. Is she happy with the way in which the government have spent the money of her constituents in Hornchurch and Upminster? Are they happy with it? Emergency demands urgency, but emergency is not an excuse for cronyism. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 328408 relating to government contracts during the Covid-19 outbreak. I now call Adam Holloway.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to serve with you as the Chair, and I congratulate the member for Gower for this, getting this very important debate. I wish to make a declaration that family members, friends and constituents are employed by or have an interest in companies that carry out work for government contracts. On this occasion, I wish to speak about my constituent, Samir Jassel, who's also a local councillor in Gravesham. Around him and the company, I can't remember what it's called, something Farmer, that the honourable member referred to, there is this absurd narrative that he got over £100 million worth of business because of links to the Conservative Party. To me, and I know him quite well, it is utterly preposterous to say that because somebody stood twice in unwinnable parliamentary seats, because they twice managed to get themselves a photograph with David Cameron, because they twice managed to get themselves a picture with Boris, and because they once gave £4,000 to the Gravesham Conservative Association, and being the councillor for Painters Ash, that somehow this buys you calls from Matt Hancock, whose honour is also impugned in this, when Matt Hancock sort of rings you up because you've given £4,000 and had a few photographs taken with a, "Oi mate, want to make a few £100,000 next week on PPE." I mean, it's utterly preposterous. According to Trump, the CIA were scouring China at a time when this equipment was in globally short supply. There was global competition for this stuff. And we all remember in our constituencies the hospitals and the care homes screaming for this stuff. I remember getting a video from one of my friends who's a nurse in the local hospital showing me a store cupboard and the sell-by dates of some of the PPE in there, which is like a couple of years old. It didn't actually matter, apparently. But there was just this awful tension and this ghastly situation. So this was a national emergency at a time of huge global competition for the very same boxes of equipment sitting or waiting to, in Chinese warehouses or waiting to come off their production lines. So if we had just relied on the state sector or our existing suppliers, this equipment would have been shipped elsewhere in the world. So to me, entrepreneurs like Samir Jassel and the civil servants that work with them are actually heroes. And I think that the BBC, some honourable members, and the so-called Good Law Project should have the humility to accept that. Thank you.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Ms Fauvargue, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship in this important debate brought to us by the member for Gower from the Petitions Committee. Ms Fauvargue, our constituents expect two things from government procurement. Firstly, for the government to be careful with public funds, and secondly, for ministers to undertake their duties honestly and with integrity. Sadly, these two requirements appear to be severely lacking in our current arrangements. The government's approach to contracting has been marred by waste, cronyism, and a deep disrespect for our NHS heroes. The government spends over 22 billion, even 37 billion, I believe the member for Gower said, on the test and trace system, which appears to make a marginal difference only, but then only £3.50 a week extra for our nurses. £7,000 a day can be spent on management consultants, while withholding a much needed pay increase for our NHS heroes. The values are all wrong. The government approach has lacked transparency from the start, and as the High Court has ruled, the government acted unlawfully on transparency and publishing contracts in a timely manner. The Prime Minister brushed off this suggestion, saying that the government had published a few PPE contracts a fortnight late. Many contracts were not for personal protective equipment, but for management consultants and other services. And many contracts still remain unpublished, some being published as late as 97 days after the recommended deadline. The Prime Minister also said that the outstanding contracts were there on the record for everybody to see, but it recently emerged in a court order that 100 contracts were still waiting at the time to be published, and one dating as far back as March 2020. The government must take urgent action now to rapidly ramp up transparency and stop the huge waste to the public purse. They must publish these outstanding contracts and publish the companies in the VIP fast lane now. It's not good enough for people to be able to write to a government minister in the House of Lords who they happen to know in order to fast track their particular company for a contract. The emergency procurement powers should now be wound down immediately and money clawed back on contracts that have not delivered. If there's money to be clawed back, and there appears to be a largesse there in the government spraying money around on some of these contracts, why not use it instead of hiding the available money, which should be made available for staff where there's no sick pay in their job and therefore they cannot self-isolate, thereby spreading the virus. That would be a very good use of public money. It was recently revealed in explosive emails about Public First, which had a strong connection with Mr. Cummings and another member of staff from number 10 Downing Street called Lee Kane. They appeared to be getting work to do focus groups. And to the mind of my constituents, this is an utter waste of money at a crucial time when we should be focusing the resources on our NHS. The High Court also ruled that the Health Secretary had acted unlawfully on transparency and publishing contracts on time. These are damning revelations, and I wonder whether the Minister can answer at the end of this debate as to what the medical regulator has said regarding the Health Secretary's pub landlord who won a lucrative contract after a WhatsApp message exchange, but appeared to lack the relevant experience. We need to do things differently, Ms. Fauvargue, and I will conclude my remarks in the next minute on what I think needs to be done. Firstly, we need to re-examine whether the instinct to immediately contract out is in fact the best way to run public services. Surely we should have a properly funded health service to directly provide public services for our health service. Secondly, are our freedom of information requirements and practices sufficient to cope with the requirements on them? For example, do the private companies who are successful in contracts, are they subject to freedom of information requests? I don't believe they are. We as MPs want to know the information. We want to know whether the money is being spent in a transparent way. And finally, we need, as a parliament, to demand that the government makes the UK a world leader in transparency again, which we did used to be, by introducing a genuinely independent anti-corruption commissioner, which the member for Gower mentioned, because obviously the independent anti-corruption minister should not be married to an individual who is in charge of an operational contract. That just does not look right. It just does not appear to be transparent, and that must be changed as soon as possible, regardless of who the individuals are. It is simply inappropriate to have a spouse being purveying the corrupt or not corrupt practices of a government. And finally, we need to establish an Integrity and Ethics Commission, which covers a number of different government functions, from the Electoral Commission, which I believe, reading the papers over the weekend, the Prime Minister now wants to water down any provision to bring in punishment against MPs who may be doing the wrong thing. That's going against what our constituents actually want. And this Integrity and Ethics Commission could lay out what we consider to be the Nolan principles, which appear at the moment to be being ignored, whether that's with individual MPs, ministers, or individual companies taking out contracts. We must have the highest standards in public service and in public life. And I thank Ms. Vervaag for this, for chairing this session, and for the Petitions Commission and every single petitioner who is watching this debate. And I thank them for bringing this to our attention.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under you today. And can I thank my honourable friend, the member for Gower, for leading on this debate, and of course, everyone who took the time to sign the petition. The government's approach to procurement during the pandemic has been marred by rampant cronyism, as well as huge wasting of taxpayers' money. They have shown a consistent track record of handing out contracts to their mates and even breaking the law along the way. Whilst it was apparent that the government had to procure large volumes of goods and services quickly to meet demand, this is no excuse for the serious levels of cronyism and corruption that are now becoming apparent. The National Audit Office investigation into government procurement showed that the government awarded £18 billion of contracts using emergency procurement regulations to buy goods, services and works to support its response to the pandemic. £10.5 billion was awarded directly without any competition. £6.7 billion was awarded directly to pre-approved suppliers, although they were not necessarily pre-approved for the products that they were selling. And only £0.2 billion was awarded using a competitive process. This approach to procurement naturally led to issues of quality, such as the 50 million face masks bought in April last year, which could not be used in the NHS because they did not meet its specifications. Over £2 billion worth of these contracts were awarded to firms with links to the Tories, with cabinet members personally intervening to help their associates win lucrative contracts. Just under 2 weeks ago, the High Court ruled that the Cabinet Secretary broke the law by acting with apparent bias after a £560,000 contract was awarded to Public First without the tender going out for competition. Public First were found by the High Court to be a company with close links to the Cabinet Secretary and the former Number 10 aide Dominic Cummings. In February this year, the Government Legal Department stated that the cost for defending this case reached £600,000. This was more than the original contract was worth in the first place. It was shocking that this government used taxpayers' money to cover up their own law breaking, whilst frontline workers were not adequately protected with the high-quality PPE they needed, or when our NHS staff could not be afforded a decent pay rise. And whilst the government are only managing to invest 20 pence per child per day in their so-called catch-up plan. I hope the Minister here today can tell us the total amount of taxpayers' money that has been spent by this government in covering up the fact that they acted unlawfully in awarding this contract to Public First. And could the Minister tell us what the government are doing to recover the taxpayers' money that was handed out to Public First? The National Audit Office investigation into government procurement also found specific examples of insufficient documentation being produced on key decisions, or on how risks such as perceived or actual conflicts of interest were identified or managed. In addition, several contracts were awarded retrospectively or have not been published in a timely manner. The lack of adequate documentation meant that the National Audit Office was not able to give assurance that the government adequately mitigated the increased risks arising from emergency procurement or applied appropriate commercial practices in all cases. There is no doubt that this has diminished public transparency and public confidence severely. And we can see the public feeling from the numbers that have signed this e-petition. Does the Minister agree with me that the use of emergency procurement powers needs to be wound down and all contracts awarded using such powers must be published with an assumption against redactions and in favour of uploading all contract documents? Let us be clear. None of this has happened in isolation. It is a case of the wealthy elite being given priority to become wealthier out of a pandemic. This is wrong on so many levels. We know that an independent public inquiry will be held in spring 2022, with the exact scope of the review yet to be determined. But does the Minister agree with me that the government's approach to public procurement during the Covid-19 pandemic must be explicitly examined as part of the public inquiry into the handling of the crisis? As the 127,000 strong petition states, there must be a public inquiry to ascertain whether contracts had been procured fairly and represent value for money for taxpayers. The public have a right to know if their money was spent wisely and properly, along with wider scrutiny of the government's pandemic response. Thank you.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to talk about not just contracts that have been awarded, but rather contracts that have not been awarded, in particular contracts to UK manufacturers and particularly the UK diagnostics sector. The Prime Minister repeatedly tells us he wants to build back better, to level up, to invest in global Britain, etc., etc. However, with regards to lateral flow devices, the government has signed an undisclosed contract for an undisclosed sum of money that I've been trying to get to the bottom of for some time for Innova lateral flow test devices. And back in November 2020, I was passed a copy of the data sheet that comes with any medical device or medical product, and in there it clearly states that these tests are unsuitable for asymptomatic subjects. So, in other words, we would be using them for a purpose that they are neither designed for or licensed for. I raised this with the Deputy CMO in a briefing on the 17th of November 1920, and I was assured that they had gone through validation, and I was also promised a copy of the information that supported that validation, but it never arrived. Later that month, in front of the Select Committee, I asked the Secretary of State about his media appearances in the weekend prior to that, where he announced the use of lateral flow devices as being almost 100%, 99% accurate. And I asked him that because there were growing bodies of evidence and opinions in the BMJ, not some rag from subject to speculation, that these tests were actually unsuitable for the purposes they were about to be employed. And I was seriously concerned because there was a possibility that not only would a false positive be incorrect, but a false negative would be incorrect. And in-field data suggested that this could be as low as 50%. In other words, your test result was effectively the flip of a coin. It was no more or no less certain than that. I have, over time, continued to explore this and try to hold the Secretary of State to account on this matter. I would reflect on one comment that was made in the BNJ at this time, was that the government's approach to COVID testing was an unevaluated, under-designed and costly mess. And the Secretary of State's response to that was that his assessment of that description was wrong. However, fast forward until June of this year, and the FDA in the United States, again, not some fly-by-night outfit, have said that the medical group COVID test kits used in Britain fall under Category 1, which, and I'll read the risk that's attached to that verbatim, a situation in which there is a reasonable probability that the use of or exposure to a violative product will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. Now, the example that I used with my staff to try and explain to them why I was so interested in this was quite a simple one. If you were using these tests as a gatekeeper for someone who was about to be allowed into a care home to visit their relative and they had a false negative, then you were allowing that person who may be asymptomatic, difficult to know what their viral shedding was, you were allowing them into a care home with the most vulnerable of people, and accompanying that decision was footage on the BBC of a relative visiting their elderly parent, hugging them and kissing them in a day room full of other vulnerable people. Now, I know the government have tried to be as optimistic as possible throughout this pandemic, and in some respects I congratulate them for that, because it's important to lift the mood of the population at a difficult time. But it is simply unacceptable to say that something provides reassurance when that is simply not the case. And I could go on to give various other examples, but this was no surprise to the Secretary of State. This was no surprise to the Chief Medical Officer. These points were raised repeatedly in Select Committee. I raised them directly with the Chief Medical Officer. I asked those concerns, and in his response, he admitted that he was an expert in the use of lateral flow devices. But, and this relates back to the point that I've just made, that where is it? If what they're used for is to reduce risk, lateral flow tests have a substantial benefit. If, on the other hand, they are used to increase risk so that people start doing, in a very risky way, going to a care home to visit a relative, then so that people would start doing in a very risky thing they otherwise would not have done, it becomes a lot more complicated. In other words, quite deadly. And I could give you lots of examples, but I think I've hit as many of the targets as I really want to. But there are serious issues here, because there are UK providers that have been touted not by the markets, but by Lord Bethell himself as being in line for contracts, who are now, again, waiting for those contracts to be honoured. And the Minister has announced today that those contracts are now going to be given to another Chinese provider, Orient Gene. This is really, there's something wrong. How can it be, if this government truly want to level up the country, expand global Britain, How can it possibly be that Chinese providers of tests that the FDA say are deadly are continuing to be offered contracts and UK providers are going empty-handed? There are a series of serious questions that need to be answered and need to be answered by government soon. Why have the public been led to believe these tests are reliable when there is serious doubt about their usefulness since at least November 2021? Why are the tests repackaged in the NHS branding, and what are the legal implications of this? Are the NHS taking ownership as manufacturer? Why are the UK continuing to use tests deemed dangerous by the FDA for a further 2 months? There's been an extension to their exceptional usage agreement. And we know they're deadly. Why? It is absolutely crazy. And why are UK manufacturers of these perfectly useful tests being sidelined for these worthless tests? I would also like to know when the contracts for these tests were signed. Were they signed before government knew that they weren't licensed for the use and purpose that they were going to be used? And who was the minister that authorised that? These are very serious questions, and I would underline a point that was made by an earlier speaker. There needs to be an anti-corruption czar appointed. Someone needs to come in and have a very hard look at the government's action on contracting throughout this pandemic, not just on what's been awarded, but also on what has not been awarded. Thank you.
Thank you. Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Ms McDonagh, and a real pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I would also like to thank the petitioners for signing up to this very important petition that has led to this extremely important debate today. I just wanted to begin with mentioning a few of the members who've spoken so far in the debate, particularly, of course, the Honourable Member for Gower, and commend her for a truly shocking start. Shocking in that she laid out for us a litany of what was, at very best, an overly relaxed approach from the UK government to normal procurement processes, asking too, on behalf of the public, where that money has gone, a really key point to this debate. And she also asked about whether the anti-corruption champion of the UK government is going to take this up. Perhaps not. Perhaps the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Perhaps not. The Health Secretary, the Prime Minister. Trust in these politicians, I'm afraid, is severely lacking. And I loved the line that she finished with. Urgency is not an excuse for cronyism, a statement I would heartily endorse. I note the member for Gravesham's contribution. I would gently say to him that national emergency does not, I'm afraid, disqualify government from proper examination of what looks like to the public questionable decisions over very large amounts of public money. The member for Hornsey and Wood Green asked some excellent questions, particularly about the accountability of some of these private businesses that the government has so hastily entered into contracts with, the inappropriate connections between key players, something the Honourable Member for Gower also mentioned, and called for an integrity and accountability, I think it was, executive. Particularly in light of the UK government's apparent intention to have prosecution powers removed from the Electoral Commission. I think everyone recognises that governing in a pandemic is not the same as governing in calmer times, and that there are decisions which need made in such times that are well out of the ordinary. I don't think that anyone would argue that a normal procurement process would be appropriate or timely enough. Now, there may be a case to be made that stocks of disposable items should have been higher, or contracts in place to secure additional stocks at short notice at standard costs. Now, these, I'm sure, are likely to be issues that the inquiries after the pandemic will look at and make recommendations on. I think, though, that we can still look at what happened and how the emergency aspects were handled and where the money went, because it's important. And we should also be certain that the awarding of contracts was fair. The terms of this petition are important. The action that the petition asks of us is equally important. And the responsibility of any elected politician to answer properly to the electorate is paramount. My own queries of the government, Ms MacDonald, have been less than enlightening, I have to say. Back in early September of last year, I asked the Leader of the House for a debate in government time on contracts awarded without tendering. I received no such commitment. Perhaps you won't be surprised to learn, Ms MacDonald, but I did receive an assurance that didn't reassure, that it was through our free press and our outspoken House of Commons that we had, and I quote, such an honest and uncorrupt country. In March of this year, I asked how much was paid out under the contracts in advance of delivery, how much had actually been clawed back for services or products not delivered, and how much was the government still to pursue in repayments. The Minister replying said that the government was undertaking a stocktake and audit, so I'd be very pleased if the Minister would be able to update us on the progress of that stocktake and audit. However, a written question of mine back in April asked how many contracts were issued without tendering, what the total value of those contracts is, how many of those contracts required advance payments, and how many times the supplier failed to fulfil the contract. I was told that 1,151 contracts worth an estimated £19 billion were published by the 1st of April, the majority of which were let using a direct award. I was told that a number, an unspecified number, but a number of PPE contracts had advance payments, but that since different teams within one department handled different contracts, the information about performance and reclaiming money already laid out was not available and could only be gathered at disproportionate cost. It's very interesting to see how costs become disproportionate sometimes, isn't it? I also got a disproportionate cost answer when I asked for the diary of the Executive Chair of Test and Trace. Perhaps there's a very complicated system used for that diary. Now, we've all seen the documentary reportage where suppliers of PPE and other equipment spoke about being unable to get through to the government to offer what they already had, while contracts were being handed out to all and sundry, including chocolate makers and companies that never existed before securing a contract. We've heard of the VIP line for people recommended by ministers. We've read the stories of WhatsApp messages with pub landlords. We've heard about equipment arriving that wasn't fit for use, and we have heard plenty about shortages causing problems. We don't need ministerial excuses. We don't need lame explanations or finger-pointing. We just need to know what went on and whether it was all above board, and we need an independent and unbiased review of it. And that's why the government should agree to this very specific inquiry, so we can see what went on. Furthermore, the government, I think, should be opening up the filing cabinets as well. Let's see the cabinet minutes on COVID and how decisions were made about securing adequate supplies of PPE, sanitizer, ventilators, drugs, beds for the pop-up hospitals, and so on. Let's see the memos and the notes of phone calls made, the emails sent and the directions given to civil servants. Let's see all of that and compare it to what ministers were told was needed and what needed to be done to keep people safe and alive. Now, a disgruntled former employee has recently been dribbling out selected bits of conversations with the Prime Minister and other little snippets which I'm sure reporters have enjoyed covering, but it is no way to do things. The bitter revenge of a man who proved inadequate does no one any good, so the government should just do us all a favour. A commitment now to an inquiry into the COVID contracts would be good. A full inquiry by an outside source, make it a judge or an ex-judge if you want. Lady Hale may well be available. Give her a wide remit and a support team of experts. Ask her to report as early as she can, give her full access to all documentation, and give her all of the resources she needs to do the job. When this pandemic passes, it will be important that people can have confidence in their governments again. Now, Scotland will be independent soon, and it won't matter so much to us, but for the people of England, it will matter a great deal. And for once, this government can do the right thing.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Vervaag, and I'm thankful to the Honourable Member for Gower for leading this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I'm overall thankful for all the people who signed the petition and for those people who created this petition, because it means that, whether welcome or not, we have to have this debate in front of the House, be it on a Monday evening and in a small area. This debate should be happening on the floor of the House of Commons, but the government don't seem to be too keen, Ms Vervaag, to have that debate, so we're having it here. So thank you to all those petition signers, everyone who took the time, because this debate is not going away. As the member for Gower said, over 125,000 people have signed this e-petition, which shows the strength of the feeling across the country. And they signed it last year. I think if the petition had stayed open, we would have had a lot more signatures, because it didn't stop there when people were signing. It's carried on. It is carrying on now. There are questions to be answered. The British public, quite rightly, don't like a cover-up. And yet even the first response to this petition by the government had to be sent back by the Petition Committee, thank you Petition Committee, as it was trying to dodge the question, didn't really answer it, and so had to resend in its homework, which was a bit better, but is still not good enough. Labour has been calling for this independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the COVID pandemic for months, and the government's contracts must form a part of this inquiry. That's what the public is asking for in this petition, and that is what we need to see. As we saw from what the Honourable Member for Gower said very eloquently, outlining many different contracts which have questions to answer, contracts for PPE, for free school meals and for others, that we need to have an inquiry. The member for Hornsey and Wood Green was quite right in saying the public want to be careful with the money. They want to know how money is being spent. They want to see the details being published. And there are key questions about government appointments, about standards of ethics that we want to see answered. That would be, these would be key recommendations of any inquiry, I am sure. And the member for Jarrow quite rightly went through the shocking costs of some of the contracts. Not shocking in terms of their cost. This is money that needed to be spent, and quickly and urgently, to save lives. But the potential waste behind those contracts, and the concerns that public confidence has been diminished because of the way the contracting has carried out. It's really important to have an inquiry because there are clearly questions to be answered, because these lessons need to be learnt rapidly. I'm concerned about leaving them all to the public inquiry, to be honest. I think these questions need to be answered now about the contracting that's happening now. So a rapid-fire inquiry and also being part of the public inquiry would be the best response to the questions being asked. And because it's so important. This day could have been the day that was being termed Freedom Day. Who knows, with a correct track and trace contract, correctly administered, one that we could have confidence in, it may be that we didn't have to rely only on the vaccine rollout, which is impressive, but good test and trace could have enabled us to be opening up today even. That's how important this issue is. The government's reply to the petition referred to the Boardman review, but that is not an independent and unbiased review and just adds to the lack of transparency. It just looks more and more as if the Conservatives are set on glossing over the cronyism in their ranks so that they can carry on as if nothing has happened. The government have promised a COVID inquiry at the appropriate time, but the appropriate time to look into these contracts is now. The next pandemic could arrive tomorrow. It's an ever-present threat, and the next one could be bigger and more deadly than COVID. The government cannot kick this inquiry down the road because at a moment of crisis is when our contracting should be better than normal, higher standards than normal, more reliable than normal, not with more questions, more concerning, is given out to my mates kind of contracting. So the question I and many colleagues here and the public need to be answered today is, how did the urgent scramble to procure resources we needed to get us through the pandemic descend into corruption, waste, cronyism and secrecy? Why is this emergency contracting still going on? What has changed? Is anything better? It didn't have to be this way. It shouldn't have to be this way. And it can't be this way when the next pandemic hits. In the last 12 months, the government have ordered £280 million worth of masks that didn't meet the required standards. They've spent over £100 million on gowns without technical checks that couldn't be used. These were purchased by Pestflix, the company which specialises in pest control products, and which by the government's own admission was dormant in 2018 and then referred to by the VIP channel. And as the Good Law Project uncovered last month, officials at the Department for Health were aware that Pestflix agent may have been bribing officials in China. And most concerningly of all, they've awarded almost £2 billion in COVID contracts to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. Now, the member for Gravesham raised those points and he said that there's nothing to see here. But actually, I think he made a good argument for an inquiry. If there are companies who feel, I will give way.
No objection at all to an inquiry. I was just really trying to point out how absolutely preposterous it is for one of the key pillars of this whole argument there's somehow been corruption, that a bloke in Gravesend gives £4,000 to the Tory party and the other things I list, and suddenly has the government giving multi-million-dollar pound contract. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous.
I would say in response to the honourable member that there is far more, there's just too much here to be answered. It's not just at the odd small company here and there. There's been a real pattern of corruption. One more time.
But this is one of the main planks, and it just doesn't stack up. It just do you really think Matt Hancock is going to give £103 million contracts to someone because they were once a parliamentary candidate and they edged in a picture with Boris? I mean, it's absurd, and it's one of your main planks.
Can I remind members not to refer to honourable members by name, please, but by position?
Of course. No, gee.
And the honourable member has made my case for me. If there are questions, if there's nothing to see here, let's have an inquiry. The public have signed this petition in their thousands because they don't have confidence in these contracts. They want to see an inquiry. If there's nothing to see here, if there's everything is above board and all was fine, then we would find out in the inquiry. But it's public concern that's brought us here today. There are questions to be answered. There is a pattern of cronyism that the public are seeing, and that's why an inquiry would be the right response. It's not good enough for ministers to say that, of course, we needed these items urgently back in March. No question there. So stop complaining about how we did it. Of course we did need them. Of course systems had to be used to get our NHS staff all the safety equipment they needed then and there. But all checks and balances didn't need to go out of the window. Ministers should still check their family connections. They should still register interests. The best companies should not be overlooked in favour of Tory party donors. These emergency systems should not still be in place so long after they are needed. 126,000 people signed this petition last year, and yet we're still uncovering more of the same issues they're concerned about. They are right to feel ignored, and a public inquiry would listen to their concerns. Only a few weeks ago it emerged that the Home Secretary lobbied the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on behalf of a healthcare firm trying to get a government contract. The Home Secretary wrote to him expressing disappointment that the government had not bought face masks from a company that had links to someone she knew. This is a glaring and flagrant breach of the Ministerial Code and does need to be investigated. Then, of course, there's the hundreds of millions of pounds handed to Serco to run the national test and trace system. £37 billion was earmarked. It's reported that £277 million has been signed by now. Why is there the discrepancy here? What were those contracts for? Where did they go to? And will we get money back for those contracts that weren't delivered? The Local Government Association found last year that local contact tracing systems have a 97.1% success rate at finding close contacts and advising them to self-isolate. This is considerably better than the centralised system. So rushing to go to the private sector in many cases would have been the right thing to do, but was it always the right thing to do? Incidentally, only last week, Serco upgraded its profit forecast by £15 million thanks to its test and trace work. But it's not just opposition MPs making these points either, Chair. Transparency International have identified 73 contracts worth more than £3.7 billion, equivalent to 20% of the Covid-19 contracts between February and November 2020. that raise one or more flags for possible corruption. They conclude, and I quote, that there was a systematic bias towards those with connections to the party of government in Westminster. They found that 72% of the COVID-related contracts awarded in the sample period were reported after a 30-day deadline, and £7.4 billion of contracts were reported more than 100 days after the contract was awarded. In comparison, for example, on average, it took the Ukrainian government less than a day to publish information on 103,000 COVID-19 contracts after they were awarded during the same period. On this point, I think that at least the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster owes us a statement to Parliament, setting out where the UK has not complied with its legal transparency obligations, how they're being rectified, and how these issues will be prevented in the future. When the Minister comes to respond, she will no doubt tell us that the governments and markets faced unprecedented global demand for PPE, and that in a short space of time, the government procured billions of items of PPE. This just does not wash anymore, and that's why the public wanted this debate. The months preceding the first lockdown are a sorry tale of complacency and missed opportunities, leading to that scramble for PPE. There should never have been a shortage in the first place. So we need an inquiry to answer questions about what happened and to make strong recommendations about what to put in place in the future. An inquiry should assess the performance of companies that did go through the emergency contracting procedures, such as Ayanda, Randox and Pestflix that have been mentioned by other members in this debate. An inquiry should speak to the companies affected, including the CEO of the UK Fashion and Textiles Association, which represents 2,500 companies and first engaged with the government on March the 18th last year, who said that the domestic procurement operation had been slow to grind into gear, failed to tap into industry expertise, companies waiting to deliver on the much-needed PPE that were overlooked. And an inquiry must look into why the government sidelined companies like Arco, who have extensive experience providing health-grade PPE prior to the pandemic. They've provided PPE during Ebola, swine flu, avian flu, foot and mouth. They only secured £14 million worth of contracts over the last year during the pandemic. They could have fulfilled far more, and they are at a loss to know why they didn't get into the VIP lane. And on the VIP lane, it will no doubt be argued in a moment that the VIP lane was a perfectly reasonable and rational solution to the mass of offers to supply equipment at the start of the pandemic. However, the opposite was true. We've seen evidence presented in recent High Court hearings showing emails that civil servants raised the alarm that they were drowning in VIP requests from political connections that don't have the correct certification or pass due diligence. It doesn't seem, for us as outsiders, that the VIP lane worked, shouldn't be used in any future emergency contracting, shouldn't be used in a future crisis, but an inquiry would tell us more, give us those recommendations. As the Good Law Project puts it, this is the cost of cronyism. Good administration suffers. Efficient buying of PPE suffers. And so to close, I and members here and the British public and the petitioners for this debate would like answers from the Minister for 4 key questions. Will there be a rapid-fire inquiry? Will the COVID contracts be part of the major COVID inquiry? Second, what's her department doing to claw back the cash from those companies who provided the government with millions of items of unsafe, unusable PPE at a time of unprecedented national crisis? And what are the options in the contracts, because we can't see them, what are the options that the government has in terms of clawback? It's very important that we know. Third, will the government finally, as the opposition have been calling for months, deliver full transparency of this VIP lane, including publishing the names of the companies awarded the contracts via the channel, who made referrals to it, and whether any conflicts of interest were identified and addressed? It's important to know this, otherwise the information will just keep dripping out bit by bit and we'll find out partially what's going on. If there's nothing to see here, open up the light and let's know that. And finally, will she commit her department to auditing in detail all those contracts that have raised red flags and to publishing the outcomes of the audit. Given that her department is formally responsible for improving transparency and ensuring better procurement across government, we expect the Cabinet Office to take responsibility for what happened, to learn the lessons for this never to happen again, and ensure that if there's a future crisis, we have the best contracting facilities for the best companies to deliver what we need immediately. That's what the British public want to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cabral. Again, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank all honourable members who have taken part in this evening's petition debate for what have been very valuable contributions, and also for the petitioners for initiating it. The public is absolutely right to demand we spend money with care when we procure vital goods, services and works, and I agree with the Honourable Lady Figueroa and others on that. And I've always set out to be open about the challenges that the government had to navigate at the height of the pandemic in procuring goods and services in the most urgent of situations, when we were required to move at great speed and in an incredibly complex operating environment. I was on maternity leave in the first half of 2020 as COVID took hold, so I only began my ministerial role this time last year. My time in office in relation to procurement, therefore, has been spent not only in going back to understand what happened during the early stages of the pandemic, particularly in relation to PPE, but also on how we can improve our future response to urgent challenges. And I want to assure honourable members that a huge amount of work is either underway or already completed that should reassure those members of the public who would like an inquiry. And I agree with the Honourable Lady for Putney that we don't want to wait to learn lessons. That includes an external, independent, unbiased review by the National Audit Office, 2 internal Cabinet Office reviews that have now been published, the commitment to a public inquiry into COVID that starts next spring, and of particular interest, a new procurement bill that my ministerial colleague Lord Agnew and I are drafting, which will provide commercial teams with many more extensive options in a crisis between direct award that raises understandable transparency concerns and full fat procurement that takes far too long to turn around. The fastest turnaround under the dynamic purchasing system is 6 to 8 weeks to contract award, and on an accelerated basis, the very quickest possible process would be 2 weeks, but that would assume all bid documentations in place at the start. So it can be seen that in urgent situations, this presents a real challenge. Now, on that first aspect of my work, I stood in Westminster Hall last year and I shared a candid account of my findings with the House, particularly in relation to the procurement of PPE, a subject that's been raised this evening by Honourable Members for Gower, Hornsey and Wood-Green and Jarrow, and these matters have been scrutinised by this House in many other fora. I'll go over some of that context again because I think it's incredibly important to understand the actual challenges that were faced. And I'm afraid I cannot address all of the other items that have been raised, in particular in relation to some of the education contracts, because I haven't personally investigated those. But as I described at that time from conversations with officials, the government had to work at pace in a very competitive international market to secure unprecedented volumes of essential supplies in order to protect frontline workers, and this required a colossal upscaling of effort. 450 people from across government were moved into DHSC to become a stand-up virtual team to assist with securing PPE. That team is normally only 21 people strong. In many ways, this was a really impressive feat, but it also meant that a hell of a lot of people who did not know each other, who were working remotely on a range of different IT systems. And I'd just like to say, we all assume government is one entity, but departments work in very, very different ways, often in different IT systems. It can be difficult to move people around the system and to make those systems compatible with each other. And they were dealing with product they were not familiar with in a very highly pressured market. And this led to lags in contract publication, as paperwork has been very tricky to join up across systems, and that's an issue that's been raised by the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh North and Leith. Faced with exceptional levels of global demand, the usual vendors in China, who service the NHS's central procurement function, very quickly ran out of supply, and the world descended on a few factories in that country to bid for available items. Now, in this market context, the government needed to procure with extreme urgency, often through direct award of contracts, or risk missing out on vital supplies. And I pay tribute, actually, to officials for what they achieved, because it was quite remarkable in the circumstances. Now, the government never ripped up procurement rules. There was this regulation 32C of the public contracts regulations, which predates the pandemic, and that explicitly allows for emergency procedures, including direct award. So in a situation of genuine crisis and extreme urgency, where offers had to be accepted or rejected seriously in a matter of hours or days, it simply wasn't viable to run the usual procurement timescales, even by taking advantage of accelerated processes. Now, as concern grew about the level of PPE that might be required to deal with COVID, the Prime Minister put out a call to action, and many members will recall that. And with huge commitment and energy, the British public and business responded. But that also meant that in very short order, commercial teams were dealing with over 15,000 offers of help. Leads, frankly, were coming in much faster than they could be processed. And then, when they were rejected or if they were delayed, people started chasing through their MPs. So to manage that influx of offers, a separate mailbox was set up to handle this area of work and sift credible offers from others. And the most important thing to note was that all PPE offers, no matter from where they came, went through the same 8-stage checks. And then the PPE team compared prices to those obtained within the previous 2 weeks to benchmark the competitiveness of those offers, with separate approval and additional justification required for any offers that were not within 25% of an average considered for possible approval. Also important to note, of the 493 offers which came through that priority mailbox, I understand only 47 were taken forward. In other words, 90% were rejected. Now, my honourable friend for Gresham highlights the absurdity of some of the claims of impropriety being made in this area. Certainly.
I mean, just on that, I mean, you know, this very important pillar of corruption, supposedly Samir Jassal. I mean, I remember running into him and him telling me that he'd offered some PPE and that it had spent, this is when we were screaming for it, that I think it had spent over a month being triaged to see whether it was suitable stuff. I mean, this is really preposterous.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. It's interesting to note the company ARCO has been raised by the honourable lady, and I appreciate her for raising that. It was raised by her colleague, the constituency MP for ARCO, in the Westminster Hall debate to which I referred earlier. I do wonder if we'd been in swapped seats, would I now be suggesting that that was an improper thing for that honourable lady to put forward, that that was a company in her constituency? You know, I think people were in very difficult circumstances where, you know, if you've been told that there's a company that can support the national effort here, would you not put those forward for review? I think we have to ask ourselves that question. The focus on those early procurement challenges has also obscured some tremendous successes under pressure, and we've established one of the largest and most diversified vaccine portfolios in the world. We've ordered 32 billion items of PPE, also provided over 15,000 ventilators to the NHS. So I think it's important that we don't obscure those achievements through some of the understandable concerns that have been raised when it comes to transparency. None of us wants to be sitting here answering questions about cronyism, but the challenges on some of the recording of the work, some of the challenges I've cited about the record keeping across departments, these are real challenges and things that we are trying very hard to address. And I understand why people ask questions. I've asked many of them myself, and I've been reassured by the answers that I've received from officials. As I say, it's absolutely right for the public.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Does that mean, given my questions about that weren't answered from the Minister at the time about record keeping between departments and trying to establish costs that were being clawed back, for example, from contracts that hadn't worked out, is the Minister then suggesting that that is being worked on and we are going to be able to ask those questions in the future and get some understanding of where the government's pursued costs that have been inappropriately awarded, if you like, to companies that haven't come up with the goods?
I believe there are cases where that is happening. I would have to go away and just absolutely double check for her, but I'm happy to get back to her in writing on that. Now, we've always been clear that there's going to be opportunity to look back and analyse and address some of the shortcomings that I have listed on all aspects of the pandemic, and the Prime Minister has confirmed, as honourable members will know, that an inquiry is going to be established on a statutory basis with full formal powers, and that's going to begin work in spring 22. But as I said earlier, the procurement during the pandemic has already been extensively reviewed, and members will be familiar with the NEO's report published in November, which I spoke on previously, certainly.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. I would just like to make one point and ask for her view on whether there is perceived or actual impropriety in the way that some of these contracts have been handled. And I'll just read to you information that's just come out from the Good Law Project. Uniserve Limited is a logistics firm controlled by a Mr. Ian Liddell. Prior to the pandemic, the firm had no experience in supplying PPE. Yet the firm landed a staggering £300 million plus contract in PPE from the Department of Health and Social Care, and an eye-watering £572 million deal to provide freight services for the supply of PPE. The company shares the same address as Cabinet Minister Julia Lopez MP and is based in her constituency. Does that not give you a sense that there might be something amiss? I mean, the whole issue around conflict of interest is not whether it's real, but whether a member of the public might assume that there's a concern.
should be shorter and that you refers to the chair.
I very much appreciate him raising that contract, because it's been a challenge to me as a minister. I mean, as I referred earlier, I only began this role in June in 2020. I had not been allocated a private office, I had not been given a portfolio, and then I find myself in a role on procurement, questions being asked about the company from which I rent a constituency office for. As I say, I wasn't actually in post at the time that was being decided, but the challenge is that there are questions raised that I cannot fully address because I don't have all of the information. I wasn't party to the contract, and so it's a considerable challenge, and it's something that the Honourable Member for Gresham has also raised. You know, I'm sorry.
It's all about perception.
Sorry. I appreciate his concern about perception, but it actually should be about fact. And you know, I'm happy to address any concerns that he has. You know, I find it extremely challenging to have people raising questions about my own integrity in this space when I don't feel that I have done anything improper. And I'm happy to get back to him at any questions that he might have, which I've also tried to address in other fora. As I say, we've been clear that there are opportunities to come back, analyse this situation, and also conduct reviews. And procurement during the pandemic has already extensively been looked into. As I say, the National Audit Office on Government Procurement, the report recognised that the government needed to act with extreme urgency. The NHO found no irregularities and potential conflicts of interest involving ministers in the award of contracts. The report underlined the importance of transparency in government's procurement activity. The government takes these matters extremely seriously, and we remain committed to continually improving our processes. And to this end, as I mentioned earlier, we've had 2 independent expert reviews that have been carried out by Nigel Boardman. These initially were internal reviews, but we've published them fully. And in his first, he focused on a small number of contracts in the Government Communications Service and made 28 recommendations, 24 of which we've already been implemented, and the remaining 4 will be met by the end of the calendar year. And I've been tracking progress on this very, very closely, including publication of contracts. Better training of contract managers, commercial and communication staff has begun, and there's now a requirement at the point at which a contract recommendation is made that senior civil servants, special advisors and ministers declare any interest that's either real or apparent. And then in his second wider review, Mr Boardman has identified 28 further recommendations for improvements to procurement processes across government. Progress is underway to begin the implementation of these, and a full date update of progress will be provided to the Public Accounts Committee by July 21. We're very, very grateful to Mr Boardman for his ongoing work. That review sits alongside a wider programme of work to reform public procurement, which I'm leading. In December, the Cabinet Office published our Green Paper on this, and that sets out radical reform to our procurement regulations that will drive much better value for money for the taxpayer. These proposals, which have long been in development, address several areas highlighted in the NAO report, especially mandatory transparency requirements, which would ensure processes and decisions can be monitored by anybody that wishes to do so. The proposals aim to simplify complicated processes, reduce bureaucracy and create a fair, open and competitive system, and they will strengthen transparency through the commercial life cycle from planning and procurement to contract award performance and completion. And we also intend to clarify the rules on procuring in times of extreme urgency or crisis, learning from the difficult experience of this pandemic. The Green Paper consultations resulted in over 600 responses, and they're now being analysed in detail. Now, it's already government policy to adopt and encourage greater transparency in commercial activity. Central government buyers must publish all qualifying tender documents and contracts with a contract value over £10,000 on Contracts Finder. But we recognise and regret, as I've expressed already, that there have been delays to publishing some contracts, as raised by the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green. Teams continue to work on publishing all contracts as soon as possible. Since the High Court's judgment in relation to DHSC's failure to publish some contracts, they've made significant progress. They've now published all known contract award notices and the contract documents for all historic COVID-related contracts. And as the Permanent Secretary for the Cabinet Office confirmed to the Public Accounts Committee earlier this month, all Cabinet Office contracts that related to the Regulation 32 procedure on direct awards have been published. Now, the Honourable Member for Kilcuddy and Cowdenbeath raises very important points on onshoring of critical manufacturing capability. And the DIT's Project Defend has done a lot of work in that area. Some of the testing specifics, I'm afraid I'll need to take away and raise with some of my ministerial colleagues. I would just like to address some of the points that have been raised by the Honourable Member for Jarrow, who talked about the recent High Court judgment when it comes to the public contract awarded by the Cabinet Office for Public First. I looked back in my role to better understand the context by which that was contracted, because I received some early questions when I was first in my ministerial role that I personally wanted to investigate as well. And so I just think it might be helpful if I set out a little bit more of the context of this. So back in March, there was no vaccine, no test and trace, and very little knowledge of how best to manage this novel disease. And strong messaging of the kind that could alter behaviours was, at the outset of the pandemic, one of the few tools that we had in our arsenal in the battle against transmission. It followed that the Government Communications Service needed rapidly to assess which messages would have greatest impact. We needed to turn campaigns around in lightning quick time, and teams had to be surged to deal with the unprecedented demand for effective comms material. In dealing with such an unforeseen set of circumstances, few officials knew which messages would be sufficiently hard-hitting to influence and, most importantly, to change public behaviour. And it was in this context that rapid decisions were made on comms contracts, including one that was challenged in court. That was to Public First, which was a research and policy company, and they were taken on alongside Britain Thinks as one of two companies in the market deemed to have the scale, expertise and experience to provide focus group testing in March. They were both rapidly diverted from existing work and to take a snapshot of public reaction that allowed us in government to test things like the Contain strategy, the early Stop the Spread campaign and the Stay Home message, which was deemed by the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green in some earlier comments as a waste of money. Now, a legal challenge was brought against that contract, and that was brought on three grounds: urgent procurement without competition, the proportionality of the award of 6 months, and inclusion of non-urgent work. We did not use money, as was suggested by other honourable members, to cover up, but actually to find out what happened so that we could respond to that legal challenge. That judgment found in favour of the government on two grounds. Firstly, that we were entitled to rely on the emergency procurement regulations due to extreme urgency, and secondly, that the terms of the contract, including length, were proportionate in the circumstances. As such, the court ruled that the government was entitled to award the contract on grounds of extreme urgency in response to an unprecedented global pandemic, and recognised that the very complex circumstances that we were operating in. It also recognised that a failure to provide effective comms would have put the public health at risk. On the one remaining ground of apparent bias, the judgment makes clear that the decision to award the contract was not due to any personal or professional connections, although consideration should have been given to other research agencies, and the process followed should have been more adequately demonstrated when it comes to the objective criteria used to select the supplier. The judgment nonetheless makes clear there was no suggestion of actual bias. Now, we've done a lot of work to address some of the procedural issues that were raised by this case, which I've mentioned, because I had my own concerns about it. And our implementation of the Boardman recommendations, which I've already discussed, have addressed several areas raised in the judgment. And I agree with the Honourable Lady on winding down the use of Regulation 32 in comms, and I've done a lot of work in this area. Mrs Fovard, I apologise for the length at which I responded to some of the issues raised. These are important issues and ones which I personally want to make sure that we as a government are addressing proactively. I'm very keen that we also provide greater context to some of the criticisms and challenges brought. It's absolutely fair that the public would have questions on this, and I want to try and address some of those. I'm very grateful for the valuable points raised by honourable members throughout the course of this debate. But I want to assure people the government is taking decisive action to improve transparency around procurement, alongside a full inquiry into the COVID pandemic next year. Thank you very much.
Tonia Antoniazzi to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank all of my colleagues for their contributions and the Minister for her response. The sheer number of examples of deals that have been raised go some way to explain in the depth.
Order. The sitting is suspended for 15 minutes for a division in the House.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
The debate may now continue until about 5 to 8. And I'd like to call Tonia Antoniazzi to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll take it from the top again, because I'd like to thank all of my colleagues and the Minister for their contributions and her response. The sheer number of examples of deals that have been raised go some way to explaining the depth of the issues that worry many of my constituents and obviously the constituents of many colleagues. The Honourable Member for Gravesham, made a doughty defence of his constituent, for which I'm sure he's very grateful. Unfortunately, if you benefit from public contracts that are granted without a robust tendering process and have a photo gallery with the Prime Minister and former Prime Minister, you're going to expect people to examine your contract. And yes,
thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. But by this narrative, civil servants must have been lent on by ministers to give contracts to Samir Jassel. I mean, does the honourable lady think that these civil servants have also been caught up in this web of corruption, all for 4,000 quid and a few photographs?
Well, the honourable member, he does make a point, and you think to yourself, yes, maybe. However, once, twice, 3 times, it's not just the odd case. You talk about £4,000 being not a large sum of money compared to what he made. You've got to actually be transparent and look at it and say, OK, take it on the chin, have an inquiry, let's look at it properly. And that's what the people that signed this petition want. Now, as predicted, we heard a lot of excuses from the Minister that we were expecting about the emergency, and we know it didn't have to be this way because, and I do want to shine a light on this, according to the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University, the cost of PPE and test and trace in Wales were around half of that spent in England. And we know why this is. The Welsh Labour Government didn't divvy up contracts for their mates. They gave the local authorities and those with public health expertise responsible for the test and trace system. What happened in Wales was transparent, and I am proud that it is a Welsh Labour Government that delivered that. They didn't have call handlers sitting around with nothing to do, despite the contracts with them costing hundreds of millions of pounds. A failing track and trace system, unusable PPE, millions spent on communications. Undoubtedly, a lot of this will come out in an inquiry, but the SNP spokesperson mentioned one of my favourite phrases that the government use when they don't want to find us out, the true scale of an issue, the disproportionate cost. You know what disproportionate? What is disproportionate is spending huge amounts of money on equipment that can't be used. What is also disproportionate is that the deaths of 130,000 people, 130,000 people who have left behind loved ones, they are 130,000 who will never see the answers that they truly deserve. And my honourable friend from Jarrow raised an important question that the Minister should have addressed. How much money has the government spent on defending themselves in court for that unlawful decisions that have been made? How much, Minister? Because it is important that we know. Transparency is so important, and we have not seen it with this government. I'm afraid to say that when we look at what the nurses are having in their pay rise, very, very little, but yet if you're an entrepreneur, you're seen as a hero. If you've made a lot of money, you're seen as a hero. It's not right. It doesn't sit well with us. And many, many people believe that as well.
Will she give way?
I will.
I absolutely think the nurses and everybody are heroes. I'm just saying that at a time of global emergency like that, these people were heroes because the public sector wasn't getting this equipment. The usual suppliers weren't getting it. It was entrepreneurs.
I believe that if we had been in a position where we had planned for this better, we may not have had to have been in this situation. Now, undoubtedly, I just want to finish on the fact that 128,000 people have lost their lives. Look, it has been mishandled, and there has to be an inquiry. And I want to send my love to all those that have lost someone during Covid-19. It is a horrific, it has been a terrible and horrific time, but we need that transparency. It has got to be done, and we will continue to fight for the truth for everyone. Thank you, Chair.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 328408 relating to government contracts during the Covid-19 outbreak. If many of that opinion say aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. Please will members leave the room promptly by the exit door on the left whilst observing social distancing.
Has ended.